Reactive training systems.
So a thought occurred to me the other day, and it's something like this. The principle of specificity is something that I think is pretty well known in powerlifting circles at this point. The said principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand, is basically something like this. If you want to get better at squatting, then you squat. If you want to get better at benching, then you bench. So you do the exercise that's specific to what you want to improve, because the adaptation is going to be specific as well. If you want to get better at squatting, you squat, you don't go swimming. That's obvious up to a point. Obviously, swimming doesn't make you better at squatting unless you're, so abundantly detrained that it provides a training stimulus for you, which is not very many people. So specificity then is this spectrum, and if you're on the specific end of the spectrum, then the activity that you're doing gets you a better transfer. If you're on the general end of the spectrum, then it gets you less of a transfer. Now, I found that that's true in gross conditions like that if we're comparing squatting and swimming. But if we're comparing two smaller examples, then it's not so cut and dry. So what I mean by that is let's take, for example, the 2-count pause bench versus the pin press. Now, if we look at it in terms of specificity and measure specificity in terms of dynamic correspondence, the 2-count pause bench is going to be more specific than the pin press. But I can tell you that not everyone is going to get a better transfer from 2-count pause bench versus pin press. I'm an example of that. Lots of people that I coach do great with 2-count pause benching. I personally do not. So for me, pin presses are a better option. So if you're training going into a competition, then you want to select movements that are providing you a good transfer, not simply highly specific movements. If you just pick high specificity movements, you'll be mostly right most of the time, but that's not what anybody's really after here. We're after fine-tuning your training programs and really making it work for you, and really kind of extracting every little bit of effectiveness that we can get out of that training program. So we've got to know what movements you respond best to, and in general it's going to be something fairly specific, but it may not be the most specific that gets you the best return on your effort. Now, this applies to intensities as well, and it becomes a little bit more meaningful maybe when we start talking about it in terms of intensity. So I've had a lifter that I've used in quite a few examples at this point, but he doesn't respond well to high intensity movements. And whenever we've programmed high intensity training blocks, the results are never very good, and they always seem to fizzle. He feels beat up with high intensity training and doesn't really get that much stronger from it. Now, that's kind of the opposite from the way a lot of powerlifters work. A lot of powerlifters really thrive on the high intensity work. So it's a bit unusual to find somebody who just doesn't respond to it to such a degree. So it wouldn't make sense to send him into a competition doing training that makes him feel worse and perform worse. So it's important for someone like that to know what types of training do they respond well to, so that you can program effective training as you go into competition. The transfer of training is more important than the specificity of training. The transfer of training is what you're after. Now, typically, higher specificity training is going to transfer a bit better than low specificity training, but that's not always the case. So keep that in mind, that specificity is kind of a rule of thumb for talking about transfer. And transfer is the thing that you're really after.
Reactive training systems.